Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this second in the webinar series on asset management. My name is Margaret Bruce. I am the Program Manager for the Local Government Sustainable Energy Coalition. Together with Grace Kaufman, we present these informative webinars for our members and other allied organizations. And we hope you enjoy this presentation by David and Brown from Terra Verde. The materials are going to be available on our website after a few days after the webinar concludes. Please go there and find more information about past and upcoming webinars that you may be interested in. For those who are not familiar with the Local Government Sustainable Energy Coalition, we are a coalition of local governments within the Local Government Commission, and the LGSCC provides mentoring, peer networking, member benefits that also include discounted registration rates for our periodic forums on timely and topical matters of the day for local governments in their energy sustainability and resilience endeavors. We also provide a members-only information portal where members can network, share information, and be provided with the latest updates in the regulatory and legislative arenas. Primarily, the Local Government Sustainable Energy Coalition represents local governments before regulatory agencies in California relevant to energy. So we are the premier representative to the Public Utilities Commission. So without further ado, Grace and I welcome you to this webinar and hope you will ask lots of questions. Please check out the webinar tools on the right of your screen where you can chat or you can send questions. We'll hold questions to the end, and David and Rick can answer them at the end of the presentation. Without further ado, please welcome Rick and David and their wonderful webinar.
Thanks so much, Margaret, and good morning, everybody. Welcome. Just a quick two slides about us. This is the team presenting to you today. I'm David Burdick, the VP of Asset Management here at Terra Verde Energy, and we're also joined by Rick Brown, our founder and president. And our team is a independent energy advisory firm. We work in the public sector with counties, cities, school districts, helping with feasibility, project development, and asset management services for a range of energy projects, ranging from solar to increasingly battery storage projects, and then helping with energy efficiency analysis and implementation. And for the past 10 years, we've developed about $400 million in projects. And more recently, we've also been working with CCAs on behalf of the California Energy Commission and NREL, helping to develop some of the analytics and the programs that are needed to identify win-win-win strategies for deploying distributed energy resources like solar, battery, and EV charging stations. Today, we're going to be walking through the second of a two-part series in managing solar assets. And last month, we presented a best practices webinar addressing some of the key elements to a well-defined, well-developed asset management strategy. And so if you're interested in better understanding how to monitor, how to manage, and how to assess the performance of these systems on a regular basis, we encourage you to check out that webinar. You can find the recording at the LGSCC website. And we encourage you to take a look at that there. But today our topic is around the subject of power purchase agreement buyouts. And before we dive into the tactics to assessing and executing a buyout, I want to just make sure that we have a framework of understanding of these types of agreements in general. And so to better understand what a PPA is, it's a financial mechanism that was and is extremely popular, especially in the public sector and with nonprofits who they don't have the ability to capitalize on the tax benefits afforded by the investment tax credit for these types of projects. And so to bring the cost of technology down without the ability to capitalize on those tax benefits, years ago, this transaction model known as a power purchase agreement was created so that a third party could own and operate the asset on behalf of these agencies. And so since then, this has become a dominant type of transaction with these types of technologies, where the system is installed by and then owned and operated by a third party. And then that third party, this PPA provider, they then sell all of the energy produced by that solar system to you, to the site host, at a specified rate. All the while, they are the ones harvesting all of the rebates, the incentives, and the renewable energy credits tied to that system. As we try to better understand these agreements, there are a couple of things to point out here on the front end, and that is that these agreements, they have these stated energy rates, right? A price point for every kilowatt hour produced by these systems. And oftentimes they include rate escalators, where each year there is some measure of increase to that rate. And so here we're looking at a snapshot of a contract where we see the energy charges here at just over 12.5 cents per kilowatt hour. And then you'll notice that second highlight there is this 3.9% annual increase year over year. These agreements, they also typically include the option for the power purchaser, the client, to buy that system. And then these windows typically begin after the 6th year. The IRS has strict rules around how a third party can transfer ownership of these systems relative to the tax benefits. And so typically we see language like what's represented here in this example, where at the end of the 6th year, and then in some cases it's every year following, in some cases there's specific windows where the purchaser can decide to buy that system from the power provider. And so we're going to dive into today, how does an agency like yours assess whether or not this would make sense for you? And if so, how do you go about executing this type of transaction? So why are people like you here interested in this topic? Well, bottom line, because in many cases, a buyout like this can save agencies money, thousands upon thousands of dollars. And the cost of solar has dropped so considerably in recent years that the market value of these systems is also coming down, making these types of transactions more attractive and possible. And in the cases where your PPA rate has an escalator, it may be that the financial benefits that you're receiving as a result of the PPA have been severely hamstrung relative to expectations. Where those escalators were significant, and in some cases more substantial than the actual increase of energy costs, we're finding that some agencies are actually upside down relative to their avoided energy costs. They're actually paying more for the solar provided energy than they would be paying had they just been purchasing that same amount of energy from their utility provider. And then lastly, in other cases, in fact, we were just recently approached by an agency that they just flat out are struggling with their PPA provider around the maintenance activities, around billing issues, and just it's become increasingly a challenge for them that they're ready to break away, and they want to start fresh with either owning the system themselves or finding a new PPA provider. And so today we're going to walk you through what are some of the essential steps in better understanding whether or not this is an opportunity for your agency, and then how to go about approaching the negotiations in this type of transaction. So we're going to outline this in 6 steps that include: first, reviewing your current agreement; second, exploring your options for the cash needed for this purchase; third, assessing the system's current condition, and we'll get into details in terms of what specifically do you need to identify and understand. And then fourth, if you're looking to purchase and then own that system, you're going to then be carrying new responsibilities in the form of costs and risks of ownership. So we're going to talk about that. Fifth, we'll be analyzing the financial benefits of this type of a transaction and what type of metrics you should be looking for. And then lastly, what types of considerations should you be thinking about as you approach the actual negotiation on the buyout price. So without further ado, let's dive in to step number 1 here in reviewing your existing agreement. So before taking on too much work here, it's important to take a look at this agreement, because in some cases, these agreements don't have the option to buy out. I recently was looking at an agreement where the initial term was 20 years, and for the entirety of that initial term, there was not an option for a buyout. In that case, even then, you're still free to contact your provider to see if they're willing to negotiate. But It's important that you take a look at the agreement, looking at these commercial terms. Specifically, you want to try to identify these three things. First, what is your current purchase rate for the power, and is there an escalator? Are you upside down relative to what your utility costs would be relative to those solar costs? Second, does your agreement outline the time windows and the procedures for this type of a transaction? You know, are you able to buy out your provider, and have they outlined timelines around how soon before that window to communicate your interest in the buyout? And then lastly, an important piece to the agreement is there language that stipulates how the purchase amount or the system valuation will be assessed? And we'll dive deeply into that later on into the presentation. But these are the three things that you want to try to identify in terms of the commercial terms of your current agreement. The second question, of course, is where's the money going to come from? And the purchase price for these systems can be substantial, especially if you're looking at purchasing a substantial portfolio at year 6. The value of those systems can be substantive. And so, you know, does your agency have cash that you're willing to apply towards this purchase, or you know, are there other programs that you are interested in exploring to come up with those monies? And so we're seeing agencies looking into programs like a COP financing program or low interest loans or bonds. And then an interesting new type of transaction that we're actually working with one of our clients on is engaging a new PPA provider to provide the cash for the buyout, and then to offer that agency a new power purchase agreement with a fixed interest or fixed power purchase rate, and better terms, which we'll explain that towards the close of our presentation. But there's certainly a multitude of options available for securing the cash needed for this type of a transaction. And when we're engaged as a consultant for these types of transactions, we'll work directly with the agency and their financial advisor to help identify what are the programs available for them now that could make sense for this type of transaction. Step 3 here is to assess the state of your system, which there is a little bit of an investment here in understanding how is your system performing currently, and what are the near to long-term trends expected in terms of performance and costs. And so in this stage, you're taking first stock of the physical condition of the facility. Depending on your PPA provider's performance around maintenance, the system may be well maintained and things are fairly well on track. But in many cases, we find that PPA providers have put off maintenance. They've neglected to stay on top of annual inspections, inverter maintenance, or even cleaning the systems. And so in some cases, there may be substantial catch-up work and costs needed to bring the system back to optimal performance conditions. And in addition to looking at the physical condition of the system, a actual performance analysis should be performed to get a sense for, is this system, or are these systems producing the amount of electricity that would be expected relative to its size, its age, and its location, and then also relative to the warranties on the inverters and the solar panels themselves. And so, is there a significant distance there? And then lastly, you know, if you're going to perform these types of assessments on the system, you're likely going to need to engage your PPA provider, as they own the system. And so when you engage them to let them know you're interested in this type of transaction and you'd like to arrange for an inspection for the system, at that time, when you engage your provider, it's important you request a copy of the maintenance records as well as the warranties to get a sense for how has this system been maintained, and are their warranties still intact? Are they valid? We discussed this a little bit in our last presentation, that the inverters specifically for solar systems typically have maintenance requirements that on a regular basis have to be performed to keep the warranty intact. And so you want to make sure that you identify to what degree is your agency taking on risk relative to these warranties as a result of the maintenance activities of your current provider. So after getting a sense for the current condition of the system, the next piece is to identify, you know, what will the responsibilities and the costs be for your agency should you take ownership of the system. Up until this point, your agency hasn't had the responsibility of operating and maintaining the system, but of course, by purchasing that system, this becomes your world and your responsibility. And so several considerations come to mind. First of all is, will the inverters on the system need to be replaced? This is a key issue, as most inverters have a warranted life of somewhere between 10 to 15 years, and the solar panels themselves likely between 20 and 30 years. And so for most systems, over the course of its operational life, there will be a moment in time when, at least once, when the inverters will need to be replaced. And so before you take ownership of the system, it'll be important to know, how soon is that going to need to happen, and how much is that going to cost? The other piece to this cost of ownership to consider is the cost of repairs needed to bring the system back into optimal working condition. There may be panels that need to be replaced. There may need to be substantial component upgrades or repairs that are needed relative to deferred maintenance. And so understanding those costs will be important as you approach this transaction. And then one of the key pieces will be, what will the strategy be then for managing this system as an owner operator? Up until now, again, your provider has been the primary party responsible to ensure that the system is operating and it's performing well. But now this will be your responsibility. And so that's going to include activities like someone at your agency actively monitoring the system on a regular basis, ensuring that it's not just producing, but it's producing what it was expected to produce for that given day or that time period. Also, the preventive maintenance activities required to keep those inverter warranties intact, to ensure that you're staying upstream of catastrophic events that could create substantial energy loss and maintenance costs. And then looking into the cost of corrective maintenance for solar panels. This includes washing the system on a regular basis. And so getting a sense for how often should your system be washed and what are the costs of those types of maintenance activities, as well as what will the plan be to regularly assess the performance of these systems from both an energy and a finance perspective. The last piece to this is to look into the insurance cost, right? To approach your insurance provider and get a baseline cost for how much that's going to cost. When managing solar assets, again, we went into deep detail into this last month in the presentation, so I won't belabor the point here, but a few things to be thinking about relative to monitoring these assets is, of course, having the right person delegated or the right people delegated in your staff to ensure that these systems are on. Likely this will be a team effort between the facilities directors at the various locations where your systems are deployed, and then likely another staff member who's probably centrally looking at the entire portfolio, maybe in your energy department or in your facility or public works department. And then having an identified plan, a strategy that's well-defined and it's visible to the right parties within your organization around the preventative and maintenance activities that are going to be needed. For our systems that we manage within our portfolio, for each one of those systems, we've established a facilities operations plan that is initially created at the onset of that system, and that each year is revised and updated to include the contact information for all of the parties included or involved with the system. Specifically, when something goes wrong, who should be notified and what's the appropriate communication channels and current contact information for those folks to, again, minimize downtime and to ensure that issues are quickly identified, that there's a well-defined plan for addressing these challenges. And these types of kind of simple upstream planning activities will drive down your maintenance and your operations costs significantly. And so before you take ownership of the system, bottom line, have a well-defined strategy that your team has in place and understand what will the cost be associated with taking ownership of that system. To help you down the road of what that might look like, I just wanted to review a couple of pages from the types of reporting that we provide on our asset management reports. And here we're looking at page 1 of an annual financial report for a fleet of systems owned by one of our clients. And this top metric here under metric phase 1, the avoided cost of electricity, this is one of those pieces where your team needs to understand, okay, to what degree are you realizing the expected cost benefit from these systems? And so how much would your electricity bills had cost had you not had these systems operating? And providing that type of A/B analysis really gives you clarity into the degree to which your agency is benefiting from these systems. And then coupled with that avoided cost of electricity, looking at the rebates, which likely at this time have already been burned through, and then the renewable energy credit sales, which is an interesting piece increasingly because these renewable energy certificates are becoming more and more valuable. We're seeing prices upwards of $2 to $3 a megawatt hour for each of these renewable energy certificates. And so it's likely that up until this point, your PPA provider has had the rights to claim the benefits from those RECs. But in this transaction, should your agency choose to take ownership of and then to sell those credits, you're likely creating not an overwhelmingly substantial revenue stream, but certainly some meaningful amount of money that's going to help offset the maintenance costs of your system. And so visibility into that. In the case of this report, this district decided to retain and not sell their credits, and that there's the reason why they didn't have any actual recognized revenue from REC sales that year. But then as you look into avoided electricity costs, these revenue streams, your maintenance and costs of capital, then you get to a true net financial benefit to your agency, which is the type of number that you should be looking at least on an annual basis, if not more regularly. Apologize, everybody. Hold on just a moment here. Sorry about that. And we're back. So beyond looking at the financial performance on a regular basis, it's important to be looking at the power production as well as the power use profiles across your systems. And so here we're looking at a fleet level view of both energy production as well as energy usage. And you can see here there's an established baseline, the blue line, for what a typical weather year would look like in terms of production, as well as weather adjusted and actual production. And then below that, looking at the usage relative to expectations from the previous year. So what was the total energy usage? How much was actually used from the utility? How much was consumed from the solar itself? And so looking at these types of metrics really informs your practices as an energy management team and helps you be empowered as you're looking at controlling your costs and planning for your future, noticing trends before they catch up to you. On an annual basis, you should be performing those types of preventative maintenance activities that we described, visual inspections, electrical tests, to early identify issues before they become catastrophic loss events. And so here's an example of what an annual report would look like in terms of providing visibility into those annual maintenance activities. And so again, bottom line, let me move forward, is that as a agency who's considering a PPA buyout, you're considering something that could be a tremendous financial benefit to your agency, but is going to be a different world in terms of ownership responsibilities. And so it's key to identify what will those responsibilities be, what's the plan, and factor those costs in to your financial analysis. Which leads us to the fifth and near to last step here. And that is just to build a financial model that accounts for this transaction and then the subsequent future that the agency is going to be swimming through here. And so you'll need to identify several factors when coming up with your model. We suggest at least the following metrics, and that is what, again, is your current PPA rate and escalator? What will the projected solar performance be? Because this, of course, would impact specifically what your PPA costs would be if you were to continue on the current track. Or B, what your cost of electricity will be if you decide to take ownership of that system. As you're looking at the projected solar performance, there should be an identified sense of degradation from the warranties on the panels and the inverters themselves, which typically is going to be around 1% per year. And so take a look at those warranty documentations, and you'll find typically a performance degradation curve that for your specific equipment identifies what that factor would be. Next, to identify if you're planning to borrow money to purchase the system, then what will your cost of capital be? What will your cost be around washing the panels and managing these assets? What will your cost be, and when will it take place for you to replace those inverters? How much will you spend in insurance? And then what if any kind of revenues would you expect to receive from your renewable energy credit sales? Here we have an example of what this financial model might look like. This is an example model for a transaction that our team has been a part of, where on the left you're looking at the forecast of cost of PPA payments year over year. And so you can see here that for this specific agreement, there was an initial price of 12.5 cents a kilowatt hour, but there was that escalator that puts them now where they're paying this year nearly 18 cents. And so here for this particular portfolio and provider, they had established a buyout price of $2.3 million. And our team helped assess what would be the cost of capital, the cost of asset management and washing services, when and how much, how expensive would be the inverter replacement, and then cost of insurance, giving you a true kind of roll-up sense of the actual cost of ownership year over year. And then once you have both the sense of how much did it cost to continue with PPA payments versus actual ownership, you then have this delta that you can see on a cumulative basis. By the year 2029 for this agency, they'd be $820,000 in benefits received by taking ownership of the system. So in this case, it makes total financial sense for them to proceed with ownership, even though they're going to have to spend a considerable amount of money to borrow the capital and then to perform the maintenance requirements around that system. So the last piece to this is, of course, reaching a negotiated price on the buyout. And depending on the language inside of your agreement, you may or may not have room to really weigh in on and negotiate for the type of valuation method that should be used. Typically, the language we see is something around a fair market valuation, which may or may not have additional language that identifies how that valuation will be assessed. But because your system is an aging operating asset, there should be a blend of multiple methodologies that should be considered as you're looking at the value of the existing asset in its current position. So what types of methodologies could be used in this blend? Well, here's at least 3 to consider. The first is the income approach, which is the valuation based on the income that your PPA provider would expect to receive should that provider continue to enjoy the benefits of that agreement through the end of the existing term. And so that's certainly one way to take a look at that. But again, as we roll back to this escalated PPA price, that might be a substantially higher amount of money than these other valuation approaches. One other approach to valuing your system is looking at market comps, and there are agencies that are specifically focused on these types of transaction methodology or valuations, and may be able to provide for a system your size and in your region and at your age what a comparable transaction was valued at. And then lastly, the cost approach, and that is if your agency were to engage in developing a system, not the same size as your existing, but the same power production capacity. So if you've got 2 megawatts of solar across several of your facilities, and it's currently at 80% of its original capacity due to aging and degradation, you wouldn't be looking at what's the cost of installing 2 megawatts, but the 80% of that, right? So what would be the cost to develop that same power capacity of a system in today's market? And again, because the cost of solar has come down so considerably over the last several years, this cost approach in typical arrangements is going to be much less significant than the income approach, which is, again, highlights the need to take a look at multiple different versions of evaluation process to get a true sense of what is the actual value of this system. So in a few moments here, we're going to open this up for Q&A. As Margaret and Grace mentioned, we encourage you to jump onto the chat feature here on the tool to your right and to ask us your questions. But I wanted to share one final thought before we dive into the Q&A, and that is this idea of a PPA refinance. As I mentioned earlier, there is a growing type of transaction in the marketplace where there are PPA providers that, even though the tax benefits have and rebates have typically been harvested by the original PPA provider, there are still providers in the marketplace that are interested in taking ownership of these existing assets and are willing to provide the cash needed to buy out the system and willing to offer a new arrangement with better terms to your agency, namely a fixed energy cost rate, so that you don't fall prey to a substantial escalator, or in some cases better terms, where maybe at the current state your agency isn't prepared to buy out the system, but maybe that's something of interest to you in the next several years. And so if you're able to negotiate a new PPA rate at a fixed price with buyout options each year following the second or third year, for instance, that might be the right arrangement for your team. And so we're right now actually working with a couple of different agencies in varying stages, looking at engaging the marketplace for this specific type of transaction. So thank you so much for your time here. If you're interested in copies of this presentation or examples of our asset management reports, we've just recently released an article that highlights some of the ways that solar owners are exposed to substantial cost overruns or maintenance risks. If you're interested in continuing this conversation, feel free to give me a call or shoot me an email. There's my contact information there. And without further ado, we'll turn this over to Q&A.
All right, great. Thank you, David, so much. We do have a couple questions here. The first one is, in projecting future financial benefits, what assumptions do you make on future energy costs from the utility company?
That's an excellent question. So our team is invested in providing investment grade analytics around that specific question. And so staying abreast of your utility's current rate structures, rate cases that they're presenting to their regulatory bodies, super important that you take into consideration the coming shift in time of use rates or time of use windows. So it's really it's a case by case, looking at those specific utility companies, looking at those specific rate structures, and identifying what are the near term and long term trends that are actually unfolding in the marketplace. And so there's not really a simple, what the assumption is that there's detailed analysis required to come to an accurate assessment around future electricity costs. Rick, do you have anything to add to that?
Rick. Yeah, this is really important. Historically, different companies would say, oh, it's going to be 6%, it's going to be 2%, it's going to be 4%, whatever. And that traditional, that we in the days before these major changes in rate structures and time periods, we would generally project a certain percentage for your generation charge part of your bill, a certain percentage for your demand part of your bill, and a certain percentage for your fixed piece of your bill, because each of those pieces of bills actually have had a history that's differentiated. For example, the last few years, demand charges have been rising at a much faster rate than generation charges in the three incumbent investor-owned utilities. But as David said, we're now entering this period where the actual nature of the rate structures themselves, when peak prices are charged, is now changing. And so in doing a financial projection of what a solar system is going to be able to produce, it's not a straight line. It depends, for example, on when your system was in place, because there's grandfathering of the current time of use rates for existing systems. But if your system went into place 5 years ago, you have 5 more years of grandfathering under current rates, and then you're going to have to do a projection based on the future rates. If your system, however, was bought 10 years ago, you're pretty much out of that grandfathering, and so you're going to have to project based on those new time of use rates. So unfortunately, when it used to be simpler, like we could just give you a straight answer, here's the assumption we use. But as David said, it's a little bit more complicated analysis now.
Great, thank you for that thorough explanation, David and Rick. The next question we have is, what are the incentives of a PPA provider to negotiate a buyout?
That's a great question. In many cases, I should say in some cases, there are providers that had entered the market. They decided to make this play, and they've captured a lot of those initial financial benefits in the forms of the rebates and the tax incentives. But now they're in the late stages where the financial benefit is merely the revenues from selling the power, and yet the costs and the time investment of owning and operating the assets, it's hollowing out their interest. And so this varies from provider to provider. In some cases, their business model has accounted for and is built on long-term ownership. But in some cases, for instance, for one of our clients, there's a provider that they're done. They want out of this transaction. They had initially offered, I think it was just about a year ago, an initial price, and then offered here about a year later a substantially more attractive offer. They're really trying to fish for an exit out of the current agreement. And so, again, case by case, there's going to be varying perspectives from providers on approaching this type of transaction, but there certainly are providers that are looking to exit these agreements.
And alternately, there are people who both either have a strong belief that the credit value of these systems, that the amount of money they can earn on their capital is greater than the risk that the market in general might place on these kinds of assets. And so there are clearly, I literally get calls once a week from capital providers who are saying, do you have projects? Do you have projects? So there is as many people who are wanting to get out of these PPA arrangements. I would say there's as many who want to, snap up and buy up some of these.
Yep.
Wonderful. And the next question is, how would you approach factoring in warranties that have expired, such as inverters or panels?
Sure. So in the case of inverters, if the warranty has expired, the question is going to be around identifying when and how much it's going to cost to replace those inverters. Because again, likely, if you're looking at the buyout at year 6, you've probably got several years of useful life left in those inverters. But in the case of let's say it's a 15-year-old inverter, the warranty expired at year 10. It may, if the inverters are operating at a fairly substantial performance rate, it may make sense to defer the replacement of those inverters out a few years, because again, the useful life typically is going to extend well beyond the warranted life. However, if the performance of that inverter is severely impacted, it may mean that it's time to execute on that inverter replacement and secure a significant warranty that pushes it out to year 25, year 30 for the plant's operation.
And I think the point here is that there's a little bit of the tone they're putting here of things fall apart, but the reality is many PPA providers do a really good job of maintaining their systems and making sure that they are going to extend beyond their warranted life. So it isn't necessarily a problem if your warranty is expired, as long as through that inspection process that David talked about, I think it was step 2, you understand what the condition of that particular piece of equipment is, and if it's operating well, if it's been cleaned regularly, if it's been monitored and upgraded when needed, it could very well last way beyond that warranty term. So again, it comes down to following those sort of classic steps of doing the kind of inspection and maintenance work to see what is the condition of your system at the point at which you're ready to think about that buyout.
Great. And then the next question involves CCAs. So with new CCAs coming online, does this change anything with your current PPA provider?
That's an excellent question. So the PPA provider, isn't financially vested in your avoided energy costs. So it's not going to affect your relationship with your current, PPA provider. The emerging CCAs will impact your financial analytics from an avoided energy cost perspective. So factoring in the specific rates for your CCA, if your agency has opted in or not opted out of the CCA that's formed in your community. So it really doesn't affect your current PPA provider as much as it impacts your avoided energy cost on your side of that transaction relative to energy used from the solar and not from the utility.
And we've been engaged by a number of public agencies to evaluate whether to opt in or opt out relative to the impacts on the cost benefit of their solar facility, be it under a PPA or ownership arrangement. I can tell you that we've yet to find a case where it made sense for them to opt out, because while the underlying comparative rate of power from the CCA is likely a few percent less than what they, for example, would have gotten from their standard utility, most CCAs provide a bit of an adder or a kicker to the export rate of any power that you put out on the grid when you're producing more than you're using. And that additional kicker on that export rate actually, in most cases, makes staying in the CCA a better deal than staying with, going out to your utility. So that's not really a PPA relationship issue, but you should, if you're in a situation where you're going into a CCA, it probably is a good idea to do a checkup as to how it's likely to impact your finances, your financial outcome of that system.
Okay, great. And then what is the life expectancy of solar panels based on today's solar technology in years? So if there's a 1% decrease in solar system annually is expected, then do we take the efficiency of the system into account before considering taking over the PPA?
So yes, you take the efficiency degradation into considerations, and the useful life of systems has only continued to increase over the last several years, depending on the specific panels that were used on your system and the age of those panels and the maintenance activities. The question of how long will those panels continue to produce a substantial amount of power is going to vary pretty wildly from case to case. But you could safely assume that for most of the solar panels in the market, even for the past, I don't know, Rick, is 5 to 10 years maybe too wide of a window to say for the past? A
little too wide. I would say the last 7 or 8 years.
Yeah.
Prior to 7 or 8 years, there was a lot. There were panels that were out there that were not as solid as the ones that we've seen the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years.
Sure. So I mean, but the warranted life in many cases is something like 20 to 30 years. Typical cash flows for these types of projects usually range in that same 25 to 30 year window. So those are the types of kind of general numbers to be thinking about. But there, I'm sure, will be cases where systems aren't replaced or decommissioned for 35. I don't know, 40 years is realistic, but I mean, there certainly is a substantial time horizon for the useful life of these technologies.
And the caveat again there is the maintenance, as we've talked about. We had a system where the panels degraded particularly quickly because for whatever reason somebody thought that cleaning those panels with high pressure hoses made a lot of sense, and they don't. You end up having water seeping under the glass when you use high pressure washing, and it compromises the integrity of the system. So it's both the quality of the initial panel and the maintenance. Is it being done properly? That's going to have the biggest impact on the rate at which the panels degrade and how long they ultimately last.
Yep.
Okay, great. And then keeping on the theme of maintenance, If you buy your PPA and become the owner but do not have the expertise in-house to perform the maintenance of the systems, are there companies that just provide the operations and maintenance? And how do you evaluate a fair price for that component?
That's a great question. So we actually at Terra Verde have an asset management services program where we will provide not just the operations and maintenance responsibilities, but also the active monitoring and financial management of the systems, and provide the reporting and analytics needed to bring real visibility and intelligence in the current and forward-looking condition of the systems. But yes, there are service providers who will allow your agency to contract for regular washing activities and/or annual inspections, and/or monitoring and corrective maintenance. So there is a market of companies out there providing these types of services, and Terra Verde is one of them.
And I think there was a question about what is the general cost. The National Renewable Energy Lab has a website, NREL, where they do a survey around costs of maintenance and reporting and M&B and all that stuff. I think the most recent was 2016. I haven't seen the 2017 recently, but that would be a source of sort of general market information. And it varies by size, because the larger the system, the less the fixed cost of doing that maintenance is it's spread across a larger portfolio. So smaller systems, slightly more per kilowatt or per kilowatt of solar. Larger systems, slightly less. But the NREL website is a good place to go for some of that market information. That's basically, by the way, that our pricing is we try to be equal to or less than what that average is on those sites. That's kind of how we do it.
Right, and our next question is, does fair market value determined by an appraiser usually focus more on the cost of the solar system or the expected cash payments we are obligated to make?
So that's, I'm sure, going to vary case by case. And again, I think that's going to depend on so typically the language in these PPAs opens up a opportunity before the valuation occurs for both parties, both the power purchaser and the power provider, to establish what will the methodology be. So that's why we advocate in this presentation for pushing for a blended valuation model. So looking at multiple metrics, because again, depending on the way these arrangements were structured, that income approach could be pretty substantial relative to the actual cost for just replacing the system outright. So again, that's going to vary both by agreements, by provider, and by the methodology consultant who's engaged to provide the services.
Okay, and some older systems use technology that is no longer supported. For example, inverter voltage changes, positive versus negative grounding. How would you value a system that is still producing but may be difficult to maintain or replace parts?
That's an excellent question. So, in the case of a inverter where there's going to be significant costs to possibly installing a transformer or making substantial infrastructure upgrades to be able to accommodate the modern inverters, those costs would need to be accounted for in the cost of ownership assessment. So that's why these types of issues that have been identified in this question are the exact reason why the type of thorough analysis that we're suggesting here is required. Is the cost can be substantial, and they can change the economics of whether or not it makes sense to take ownership of the system. Yeah, I guess, Rick, you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, we have one example of a system that the school district came to us. System, I think, was a very early one. It was about 12, maybe 13 years old, and based on the inspection, it became clear that they were going to need to replace most of the panels and the inverters, and they decided, because the mounting system, this is a ground mounted system, was still intact, in good shape. Some of the electrical was still in good shape. They decided to go ahead and get basically get the system replaced. And they were able to salvage some again, but probably 70-80% they required replacement. So again, it's going to vary depending on the nature of the problem, the nature of the situation. So,
and the nature of the PPA price, right? So in the case of where you're upside down in your payment and that escalator is only continuing to grow, it may, though the cost might be substantial in replacing your inverters or adding additional electrical infrastructure, or in the case of this district, even repaneling the system. Looking at the financials on this type of project and transaction is what really tells the story, because it may make substantial financial sense to make those types of investments.
Great. And our next question is, should PPA providers be helping their customers evaluate the health status of the system?
That's a great question. It'll be a touchy conversation, right? Depending on the nature of the the relationship, where the PPA provider sits in terms of their interest in a buyout. It's certainly a conversation that could be had, and but keep in mind where their vested interest is related to the valuation and the inspection of that system versus yours. So yeah, but it probably in most cases would be a difficult negotiation to get them to share some of those costs. They're typically, I'm sure, going to push that off onto you.
And we've had situations where PPA providers have been very cooperative. They provided maintenance logs. They had allowed us to work closely with their O&M provider to understand the system health and so forth. And we've had others that have been very uncooperative. And in one case, it was with a city where they were uncooperative. The city decided to pursue a PR strategy that basically, I hate to put it this way, but they basically threatened the PPA provider. If they weren't cooperative, they would, report that to the news media. And the PPA provider decided to cooperate. So, you don't want to get into that kind of situation, but you do have rights, under these contracts, and particularly public agencies, because of the fishbowl effect, have some leverage that if they need to use, because this is a public entity. It has, its constituents and its taxpayers that it's accountable to, and in that regard, it needs to do everything it can to get the best value out of any investments or contracts that it's involved in.
Right. And our next question is there a benefit for a multi-building manager to buy out and take over the PPA, billing the LP owners?
I'm not sure. Could you say the question again, Grace? Because I'm a little, I didn't quite track.
Yeah. Is there a benefit for a multi-building manager to buy out and take over the PPA, billing the LP owners?
This is now more in the, I think, on the commercial or private side of the world, and we don't have quite as much experience there, but I have been in conversations with folks, with PPA providers who work with building owners, and I shouldn't call them PPA, finance, people in the solar finance world who have, put together exactly that kind of model. I think there's one company that has done projects in Sacramento and Santa Rosa. So if somebody's interested in that, I could certainly put you in touch with them. That is exactly the model that they pursued. Yeah, whoever that is, just reach out to David or I, and I'll forward your information to that company.
Great. And then the final question we have here is, how many years after the purchase of solar panels should customers contact PPA providers?
Yeah, so again, this is back to step one, which is reviewing your current agreement. Typically, your agreement is going to identify the both the window for when a purchase could happen, and then also when you would need to contact the provider. I've seen language that requires, 6 months advance notice in advance of the window to allow for proper time for the transaction to be assessed from both sides. So take a look at your agreement. Again, typically that's going to start year 6. In some cases, there's specific windows like years 6, 10, and 15. In other cases, it might be year 6 and every year subsequent to that. But take a look at your agreement, and if you need help with that type of analysis, we can certainly help you there.
Great, and that is all the questions we have for today. I am now going to turn this over to Margaret Bruce.
Okay, thanks everyone. Rick and David, do you have any final wrapping up comments and closing points that you'd like to make sure our audience comes away with?
I'd just like to say thank you for your time. It's certainly an exciting topic, and lots of folks are interested in considering these types of transactions. We do provide support to agencies that are looking into these types of transactions and understanding the costs and the feasibility, and even helping with releasing requests for proposals around engaging a new PPA provider to refinance the system. So if that's of interest to you, feel free to reach out to us, but we sure hope you found this content meaningful and helpful, and appreciate your time.
Thank you very much, both Rick and David. So for our attendees, this information will be posted on the Local Government Sustainable Energy Coalition website and will be made available to registries. Thank you again for attending, and I hope you will participate in our future webinars. Again, our site, lgsec.org, for more information about events and how to register. Thank you again, everyone. Bye for now.